What is it about music that can transform your ordinary life into something extraordinary? What is it about music that can touch us so deeply and set in motion the wheel of our emotions? Whether we celebrate each other, nature, or the divine, our desire to express ourselves through music is ancient and a cultural universal. In this program, we will explore music from all over the world and speak with guests from musical, spiritual, scientific, and other realms in a quest to share and understand how music affects us. I'm your host, BRAUN, and this is Soulscapes. Music is a tool for connection, expression, memory, and meaning. It can release feelings that are hard to put into words: joy, sadness, anger, love. Creating music gives those emotions shape and makes them easier to understand and share. It lets people tell their story, reflect their culture, or leave something behind that lasts beyond the moment. My guest today is a composer of art song, opera, and orchestral works. Of Métis and French-Canadian descent, his work explores the Canadian Indigenous experience, including the history of the Métis people, the fusion of mixed racial identity, and the intersection of Western and Indigenous cultures. Ian Cusson, welcome to Soulscapes.
Thank you so much for having me.
I say music, and you say words or thoughts that come to mind?
Expression, I think. Emotion. You know, it's music to me is one of the most important ways for me to be able to express how I feel. And I find even in the world that I live in, you know, it's hard to feel emotion sometimes because the world is coming at us at such a clip. Music sort of slows things down and is a place for me to feel deeply and to consider things and to really understand what feeling feels like.
That's a very comprehensive and beautiful answer, and you touched on a few things that I know we're going to uncover or discover together. Let's travel back to your childhood in the Georgian Bay region in Ontario for those listeners who want to know where to place you geographically. What were your earliest musical memories? Hearing music or making music?
For sure, hearing music, and you know, I come from a family that is not terribly musical. My parents were both nurses. And I heard a lot of music as a young child in school, and also through some of my uncles and aunts on my father's side. So this is my French side. They are musicians in town and still often play in local festivals and this kind of thing. Very much folky kind of country music. So I heard a lot of that as a young person. And also hearing music, you know, had fantastic teachers as a young person when I was 6 and 7, starting piano lessons and vocal lessons, and teachers who not only taught me the kind of rudiments of music, but also really sent me home with recordings, LPs of fascinating and strange and wonderful things that really opened my mind. So hearing music for sure.
So let's talk about hearing music. What kind of music? I'm imagining it was LPs. You said perhaps radio. Was it, I'll let you speak. What were the
Yeah.
genres?
Oh my gosh. Well, one of the albums that stood out, I remember it was a very, very distinctive moment for me in thinking about music differently than just, say, the traditional piano repertoire that I was learning, was this album of Mystère des Voix Bulgares.
I love them.
Oh,
Oh, I've seen them live.
No. I mean, what an incredible, incredible album that I think it came out, it was maybe reissued in the early 90s. And I remember the black cover of the LP. And I would sit on my parents' floor in the basement with headphones on, with the record on the player. And what was so incredible is that it was this different way of hearing the human voice, these Bulgarian folk singers singing traditional music. It was a very forward sound, a very nasal sound, at times brash. And then also they would have these crunchy sounds, crunchy intervallic sounds. And to me, I thought, oh, that's what you can do with music. This is possible. That was one really important one. And then I had a voice teacher as a young person. It was probably 8 or so, 9 years old, and she taught me to sing pure vowels, and I had a lovely treble voice at the time. But she loved operatic work, and in particular the works of Benjamin Britten. And she would talk at length about his operas and would encourage me to listen. And it's interesting that Britten is a sort of touch point for me. The opera Peter Grimes was so important to me as a really young person, and listen to it incessantly. I still think about it when I'm writing music now. He's sort of a touchstone for me musically, and I feel a kinship with him for sure.
I hear that kinship in your music, and we're going to get back to that again. But I'm just going back to, okay, so you're about 8 taking voice lessons, and your teacher then in a small town in Ontario has a well-rounded, sophisticated taste and says to an 8-year-old, I'm going to play you some Benjamin Britten, renowned 20th century British composer. I mean, how does that even occur?
Well, it's interesting. This teacher, her name was Jill Northey, and she lived in Elmvale, and I would travel from Midland, Penetanguishene to Elmvale every Thursday night for these voice lessons. And she was such an interesting human, a choral director, but would never speak to me as though I was 7 or 8. Spoke to me as almost an adult. And this was intimidating at times, but it also gave me a different way into art. She would talk very seriously about singers. I remember we would have extended conversations about Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau and others, and she would play recordings, and we would listen, and it was critical. We were very, very, thoughtful about the way we listened, and just encouraged I think a rigor in me, and expected a rigor in me that I didn't know was not necessarily the norm, especially being in a teeny town in the middle of nowhere, Ontario. But that was her expectation, and she was very, very clear to me that if you want to pursue a career in music, which I very much did at the time, the expectations are extremely high, and she was one of the first people that I showed my compositions to, and she was again very critical and very maybe at times harsh. And I've come to see that as an adult it shaped me in ways that were, of course, difficult, as we can have with sometimes our teachers or important people when we're growing up, but also as a person who instilled, like I said, the rigor that is required, and certainly is required of me now as a professional composer.
So you're talking though right now about having had this major exposure to very sophisticated, some people might even say highbrow classical music. And because of your mixed heritage, what other kinds of musics were you exposed to?
As a Métis person, and there's such a prominent place of the fiddle and the kind of that side of folksy things, where again it's the influence of some European cultures. I should sort of back up and say that for those who don't know, because a lot of people don't or misunderstand the Métis people, we're a post-contact people. So the people really formed a collective consciousness, cultural identity, language practice, etc., in certain communities in Canada and in the United States, at the intersection of the Western fur trade, generally men that were traveling through the area who then married Indigenous women, and the children, the offspring that came from those unions really didn't see themselves as being part of the European, their father's tradition, nor did they see themselves as being part of their mother's First Nations communities, but gathered and lived often in these very tight-knit communities. One such community is in Penetanguishene on the shores of Georgian Bay. And And so there is this beautiful intersection and fusion of musics. And even some Métis music, you know, the fiddle tradition is very much a kind of Scottish roots and that sort of
Sure.
thing, European roots. So I've always had this beautiful mix, you know, with teachers that brought me this European tradition and family members who had a European but European plus tradition, I guess you could say. There's a fun tradition in the community of celebration and kitchen parties. So the kitchen party also has roots in other communities, but this idea of celebration and fun music and joy and dancing, you know, pushing aside the tables and dancing in the kitchen, that kind of thing. So this has strong roots in our community. My family was a little bit more serious, I would say, in the sense, and I use serious very casually. They were very practical, clearly came out of the Depression times. Everything was a scarcity. You were serious about things, and so they had very little time for entertainments, if you will.
Hmm.
And so I had to kind of see other families for within the community for those traditions.
So I'm thinking of you growing up in this small town with your unique mixed heritage. Twofold question here. Uh, were there other kids? Is it a larger community of children with mixed heritage? And how were you able, or were you able to imagine a future for yourself that placed music and the arts at the center?
That's a great question. Yes, lots of children, lots of families from the community that were all intermixed. And again, you have to remember this is a community that's grown up with others that have come to the area. So we're all kind of a big mélange, if you will. It was very hard to imagine, you know, growing up in the late 80s, early 90s in a small town, having a kind of life beyond that place. You know, one of the strong things that really frustrated me or was difficult as a young person was having access to information. For example, musical scores. I wanted to look at the score of Peter Grimes, for example. I could only listen to the recording that I found in the library basement. And so I had to stick with that and figure out what he was doing on a page without being able to see the score because we didn't have that kind of connection or access to libraries that had these collections. So it was hard in some ways to imagine having a life beyond, but I was a weird child, a very precocious child, and had as I really continued and got serious about my studies as a young person, especially as a pianist, had ambitions, huge ambitions of being a concert pianist and studying at the biggest schools and having a career concertizing around the world, even though I'd never seen the world. You know, the world was in my imagination at that time. And you know, it's interesting, even in my mid 40s now, the world is still something in my imagination because I don't and haven't done a lot of travel. I've lived abroad in Japan for a time, but really much of my life exists in the world that I'm in, which is one of imagination. And so when I'm setting works or writing works that have uh, distant or far landscapes, settings, it's one that I'm conjuring in my mind because it's my frame of reference.
It's fantastical, maybe, right?
Mm,
I'm still going to go back to when you were younger
yeah.
because I'm curious. How old were you when you composed your first piece? I know you may not have had the awareness that, oh, I've composed my, but like your first little meaningful opus.
I remember one that was sort of the first work that I completed. Now you have to imagine, I would start a million works and I would rarely get to a place of completion because, you know, I would abandon them and had not really the drive to see things through. But probably the first serious work of mine was called The Invasion of the Ant Colony. And I must have been 8 or 9. And it was the first work that I fully wrote down and notated. I still have the scores in a big box. And this was a work for piano. And it was probably about a minute and a half long. And I remember the very end of the piece was a kind of pounding. Imagine you take your palms and you pound down the keyboard as the person stomps across
Right.
the ant nest. And this was the very dramatic ending. And it's funny, I think about that and the impulse that was in that little piece of drama, and that I would say has stuck with me. I have never been able to let that go. I think when I write, I am always thinking dramatically. What is the shape? What is the expression? What is the movement of this musical idea? And how is it capturing something of human longing and yearning and challenge and confrontation and elation, all of these kind of larger than life dramatic gestures and movements has stuck with my work right from the invasion of the ant colony.
Were you known in your childhood as the dramatic, artistically gifted boy from down the street?
For sure, for sure. And as a young kid, as so many of these precocious young people, misunderstood my classmates and made fun of, and I mean, I was teased incessantly because of those interests. And that was the sort of challenge of coming from a small place where people didn't know what to do with that. And what's lovely about growing older and going through music school and meeting other like-minded folks is you see, oh, actually there is a whole world of us, and we all probably share something of the small traumas or the larger traumas of being
Yep.
being misunderstood and being excluded in some ways.
I remember, because you just jogged my memory, when I was 12, we lived in Germany, and I had cassette recorders, right? And I had written little plays, and this one was called Der Smaragd von Taj Mahal. So it was like the emerald of the Taj Mahal. And it was trying to find it. It had been stolen, and we had these great big plants in the backyard, and they served as, like the weeds that we had to walk through in order to find it. So yes, my idea was also something fantastical that was not part of my immediate world. It was a fantasy, right?
Oh my gosh, I need to set this to music.
Yes. So you had alluded before to the fact that you ended up studying piano. So I'm skipping forward a little bit. You graduate high school. Obviously, your passion for music is there, and you find yourself at the wonderful Glenn Gould School in Toronto, which is part of the Royal Conservatory of Music History. So tell us about that. Did you go there because you thought, I'm going to become a concert pianist, and that is where I'm going to learn my craft the best?
Absolutely. 100%. I met the wonderful James and Agneson, who is now the dean of the Glenn Gould School. And I met him at a piano music festival in Barrie, Ontario. And he was adjudicating, and I played for him, and I approached him after at a break and said, I would like to study with you. And I was playing some wild Debussy prelude. It was the Feu d'artifice, the fireworks prelude at the end of the second book. It's just a great piece. And I think Allegro Barbaro by Bartók, these wild pieces. And he said to me, yes, you can be my student. And so actually my last years of high school, I would travel to Toronto, which is a 2-hour commute, a significant commitment to study with him every week. And then decided to continue my studies more formally and more fully at the Glenn Gould School. The Glenn Gould School experience was really, really informative for me. It was sort of like a light bulb moment. One of the pieces that was kind of difficult about that experience was realizing that I was no longer the big musical fish in the small sea, but rather there were so many incredible pianists, and all were vying for this kind of career as a concert pianist. And so it allowed me to reprioritize what was important to me and what I wanted to do. During that time, I also had the task of playing for an English diction class. So of course the singers are studying diction, and so I began accompanying singers, and I think I discovered a whole new side of music, which was this idea of collaboration, this idea of supporting the voice and really listening to the voice in ways that I had before, but I was doing with different ears. And there was one young woman in that class who asked if I would continue to accompany her in her voice lessons. And this woman now happens to be my wife. That was very convenient. But she was wonderful, and we were great friends, and we've been married now almost 25 years. And she studied, actually, interestingly enough, here's a great connection, with your mother.
That's
who
right.
was an absolute joy to sit in lessons with. You know, I here I was, not really understanding the voice and listening and supporting a singer. That was very, very, very important for me in saying, I don't know that a career as a concert pianist is even viable for me, or is something that I desire. You know, the idea of a concert pianist traveling around the world to play and not being rooted and practicing so many hours a day really wore off in my imagination. And I realized, I think the thing that I wanted at that point was probably applause. You know, an audience. I envisioned bowing in front of audiences and
What a
not
guy.
and not necessarily playing any music. And so I thought, okay, your priorities are completely off. This is, you know, the 17, 18-year-old realizing this, so still quite young. Um, and I left music school and I
Ah,
went to study English literature at the University of Toronto. And I thought, oh, well, that music journey was a complete blip in my life. I don't know what to do with myself. I'm not going to be a concert pianist, and so I left and I studied literature. And you know, it's funny now looking back. Everything in life seems to have a purpose that we don't often see in the moment, and this is
true.
so true from my experience. I had this great musical foundation and education, and in particular, having these deep connections with singers and singing teachers. And and then I had this great education in the literatures of the world and you know, scanning text and understanding how stories are assembled. And now, as a primarily as an opera composer, these are the intersection of these two things is exactly what I rely on and what I use as my materials. So it's kind of beautiful seeing how the paths, while they felt like dead ends in some ways, were actually just doors that were sort of half open and needed 10 more years to pass.
So I'm trying to envision your brain and the various compartments in it, and I'm sure there's probably a file for piano performance, for piano vocal performance. I'm sure that composition still hovered there, but now you then have a degree in English literature, and as you mentioned before, you went to Japan to do what?
Well, to teach English and
Ah,
repay some of our student loans. You know, we were married while I was a student of English literature, and then and left for 2.5, 3 years to experience the culture. My wife is half Japanese. Her mother was born in Japan, and so it was a chance to just really explore, have an adventure together before having children, and it was again, talk about the impact of an experience. This was an opportunity for me to be, and my wife, of course, to be away from the culture that we'd grown up in, to really be completely, you know, thrown into a world that felt very, very different in many ways to what we'd experienced. And then to see ourselves and to see the country that we'd come from and our own experiences, our own upbringings with different eyes. It was, you know, a formative experience for me to be able to understand myself and begin to understand myself, I guess I could say. And it required that distant vantage. And I think that that's something that living abroad, as I've learned, has offered so many people, is that
mhm.
you see yourself differently and you see your own experience differently. You know, all the good and the bad of your upbringing, the good and the bad of the culture that you come from, the country that you come from, and its political systems and whatever it might be. It really was a set of new lenses, clear lenses, to be able to look back on my life.
So then you came back. At some point, did you formalize your desire to become a composer? Meaning, did you study composition anywhere?
Well, it's interesting. You know, even before leaving for Japan, I was doing a lot of composition through my teen years, lot of writing and some vocal writing even then. Even little operatic beginnings, a lot of false starts into operatic projects, just because the form was so fascinating to me. I did have some formal education in Penetanguishene with an important Canadian composer named Samuel Dolan. And I would travel out to on Champlain Road to his little cottage where he lived in about 45 minutes from my home as a teenager, and I would study orchestration, very briefly orchestration, but mainly harmony and music theories. And I remember him saying, he was well into his 80s at the time, and he said, if you want to be my student, I expect 40 hours of work outside of our lessons each week. And so I was like, okay, well, that's a full-time job. But to me, the naive, 16-year-old, I thought, well, that's what is expected. That's what I'm supposed to do. I didn't question it. And then when coming back, I took on a job as a music director of a church for 14 years. And this was a huge, time commitment, but also a place where I would arrange music and sharpen those skills, and still was writing little pieces here and there. I realized to myself, there's something in my life that's missing. And I was probably about 30 years old at the time. I had children, and I was thinking, there's a piece that I have sort of neglected, and I can feel the neglect of that thing. And I said to myself, I want to write well. And in fact, I was very specific. I said, I have very little time in my life outside of a full-time job and outside of raising a family and being a husband and having other responsibilities in the community. I want to write operas. And what is the path to doing that? Well, Ian, you need to really hone your skill of writing for the voice. You need to hone your orchestral writing skills, which you haven't done a lot of. And you need to think about writing in longer form and what is required to write dramatic vocal work, musical work in long form. So thinking of a 2.5-hour evening. Right. And so I sort of meticulously took the wee hours of the day that I had. I made an agreement with my wife to say, can I take the 8 p.m. after the kids are in bed till 9:30 p.m. away from spending time together to go and write music in the basement? And she said, yes, you can do that, which was great. And then I reached out, sent an email to this wonderful human named Jake Heggie.
Oh, yeah.
Who I thought he didn't know me from anybody. And I sent a work of mine, a little aria, and said, could I study with you? And he said, he wrote me back within a day, which was wild, and said, I just played through your work. It's beautiful. I feel like we have a dramatic kinship in our writing. Of course, you can come and study with me if you can figure out a way to do that in San Francisco. So I got a grant, went down to San Francisco and worked with him for a short time. Very, very encouraging moment of my life. And also, looking at his career and thinking how he structured a career, was making these relationships with singers, creating work for them, and then the reciprocal side that came with that, as singers would ask for more work or tell opera producers, oh, you should look at this composer, they write really well for the voice.
How do your cultural roots shape the themes and perspectives you bring to your work that form your musical style?
Well, you mentioned sort of in my bio, one of my real interests is the place of intersection, the place of connection, because the Métis people are a post-contact people. And I should also say, I also have a whole French side, right? In a little fun sidebar, right? My grandfather, my father's father, had a half brother. So he had sort of, their family had two families, if you will. And his half brother was Gabriel Cusson, and he was the first Canadian student of Nadia Boulanger, which is kind of wild, right? Like, and I never met this man. He passed away 10 years before I was born, lived in Montreal, and was a cellist. But what a fascinating connection. And there's these lovely correspondences between Nadia Boulanger and him. So there are these threads that make up me. And one of the things that has been really, really important to me is celebrating and bringing Indigenous voice and perspective into concert works opera, because there hasn't been a long history of those places of intersection. So one of the things I love to do is set texts, poems, or commission texts from living Indigenous poets, Marilyn Dumont, Catherine Vermette, Joy Harjo, Natasha Canapé-Fontaine. The list goes on and on. It's interesting. Most of the texts that I'm drawn to are texts by women, and I think that this probably is the strongest piece of connection for me is the connection that I have through this matrilineal line of women. I'm surrounded by some of the strongest women you've ever met. I mean, my wife being one of them, my mother being another. My mother was a Teutonic force. She was an absolute, very, very socially capable, very, very smart, very connected, knew everybody, and was just so impressive to me, and a real force. And so much of our communities they have really grown on the backs of the women.
Mm. As you're talking and you're speaking about the women that have influenced you and the poets whose works have inspired you, inspiration is a sacred kind of process to me. My next question then, does spirit and spirituality play a role for you?
Hugely so. It's interesting. When I was a young person, my family was Roman Catholic. It's a strongly connected place between a lot of folks in the Métis community, because these interconnections. There's a strong tie to the Roman Catholic Church, and for me as a young person, I didn't really get it. There was something interesting about the pageantry and spectacle of that, which is a whole other thing. And I sort of rejected it as a young person. I was not interested, 13, kind of didn't want to have anything to do with it. But what was really interesting about maturing, and around the time I was at the Glenn Gould School, 18, 19, I was able to find and discover a path, a spiritual path that was my own, that wasn't sort of given to me or taught to me by my parents or my grandparents. And one of the pieces that has been really beautiful is seeing a connection between, again, like my body as an intersection of of traditions and worlds, and being able to infuse the pieces that are land-based, traditional indigenous teachings with more traditional religious teachings as well, from the Western tradition. And so, yeah, it's interesting. My work is, I feel every piece of it is connected to spirit, is connected to the experience of being human, the experience of life and death. So much of how I understand the world and what I want to add, in terms of artistic works, is showing, is giving an offer to audiences to consider, what does it mean to die well? That's a thought that I think about a lot. What does it mean to live well? But of course, what does it mean to die well? And I think we live in an age where we're so afraid of death, but there was a time when death was all around us, even more than it is today. And so how do artistic works and artistic offerings become a way of considering life, considering meaning and purpose and function while we're here, and then leaving well, leaving this life well, and hopefully leaving impact and legacy, whether it's an artistic work that is left or just the impression that one has made in the lives of the people that will continue after us. So it's very, very important to me. How does that manifest? It's interesting in different ways in different works, but it is always in my mind and always in my heart. And so I feel like when those things are there, they infuse the work.
So the air that you breathe is perfumed with that sense of spiritual connection and spirituality. And I find, when you have that in your life, that moments become more transformative. So my next question to you is, what have been some of your most transformative musical moments and experiences?
I think those very young experiences of being given recordings by teachers, that opened my mind to what was possible musically. The world when I entered music was relatively small. It was what I'd heard my uncles and aunts playing. It was what I heard on the radio. It was what I'd been taught as a young pianist, young singer. And they sort of said, well, no, these, those parameters are so small. Here is the world. Here is, and here's just the beginning of the world that you can then go and explore further. So that was, I think, critical. I think also probably going back to Benjamin Britten, hearing his opera Peter Grimes, which is his first opera after his operetta Paul Bunyan, it was the story of a man who is a kind of outcast to society, and maybe something of that resonated with me as a young person because I felt in some ways like an odd fish. The writing, the dramatic writing, the way that he fashioned these kind of this sonic landscape of the sea.
I've listened to your music, and for me, I instantly heard the lush, let's call them sonic soundscapes or landscapes of the great, great British composers like Vaughan Williams, Holst, Benjamin Britten. It's all in the music. Next year is a particularly exciting one for you because the Canadian Opera Company will premiere your opera, Empire of Wild. What's the story about, and what can listeners look forward to?
Next year is a very, very exciting year. 2027, it will be what a moment to be able to have an artistic work on the biggest stage in Canada, operatic stage. The work Empire of Wild is based on a novel by Shirley, who is Métis from the same community that I come from. And the novel is the story of a woman named Joan. And she's pining, because her husband of long time, her true love, like her true soulmate, walked out on them after a little fight 11 months before the start of the opera. And she's like, something is not right. And we move into the next scene, which takes place in a Walmart parking lot of all places. And there is a tent in the parking lot. And she hears music coming from it. So she approaches the tent and pulls the flap back. And it's a church revival service going on. And she sees at the front, right at the altar, if you will, her husband. And we learn in the opera that he is under the spell of this community figure, which is a kind of wolf man called the Rougarou. And the work is really the story of Joan learning from her grandmother, from her mother, what it takes to rescue a person who is in the grips of the Rougarou and why, in fact, they are there. So it's this one woman's journey.
People go generally to something like the opera because they want to be inspired and uplifted. Now, if you had to choose 3 or 4 pieces, I say 3 or 4, it could be 1 or 2 or 4 or 5, of music that you go to for upliftment, what would Ian Cusson's mini playlist look like?
I rarely listen to music as a background thing because I think my brain immediately grabs onto it and I'm in it. Watershed pieces for me. I mean, the trio at the end of Der Rosenkavalier by Strauss. These 3 women singing the most glorious music at the end of this great opera. I am quite moved, and this is a funny one. I'm moved very, very much by Wagner. One of my favorite of his works is Die Meistersinger. The orchestration, the writing, it's just so well done that it almost discourages me. So we're speaking shortly after the Academy Awards season, and one of the winners was a song for best song in a film was K-pop Demon Hunters' Golden. It's a great tune.
Maybe writing for movies is in your future too.
I wouldn't say no.
I would like our listeners to also be uplifted by your music as I was. And I'm going to share with them a little piece of your own writing that happens to feature the stunning voice of the soprano who is going to be the lead in Empire of Wild at the Canadian Opera Company. This piece that we're going to listen to right now, this section, can you just tell us a title and what it's about?
So I wrote this work for the Orchestra Symphonique de Montréal, and it's called Un cri s'élève en moi, a cry rises from within me. The text is by Natasha Canapé-Fontaine, who is an Innu poet from Quebec, and the singer is the wonderful Elisabeth Saint-Gelais, who will be singing the lead role in Empire of Wild. This piece is something of if you can imagine the cosmos, all of the universe, almost like the birth of the universe. I mean, her birth is the birth through which the world and the universe is born. So it's everything of the universe rolled into one 10-minute orchestral vocal work. I hope you enjoy Un cri c'est avant moi.
Un cri s'élève en moi. A cry rises within me. Music by Ian Cusson, text by Natasha Canapé-Fontaine, featuring soprano Elizabeth Saint-Gelais and the Montreal Symphony under the baton of Raphaël Paillard. Just breathtaking. Ian Cusson, we could talk for hours. Thank you for taking me on a journey through your fascinating life and for being my guest today on Soulscapes.
Thank you so much for having me, Adi.
From north to south and east to west, music inhabits every corner of our world and beyond. I hope you've enjoyed my conversation with composer Ian Cusson. I'm Adi BRAUN, and this is Soulscapes.